The story of the German-American Bund is not merely a historical footnote buried within the vast chronicles of World War II. It is a haunting reminder that extremist ideologies can flourish not only in distant lands under dictatorships, but even within the borders of a nation built on democracy, freedom, and pluralism. In the 1930s, as Adolf Hitler tightened his grip on Germany and the world braced itself for the violent reshaping of global order, there were thousands of Americans who looked across the Atlantic, not with fear or condemnation, but with admiration, fascination, and a disturbing sense of ideological kinship. The Bund did not emerge from the margins. It grew openly, organizing massive rallies, running summer camps patterned after the Hitler Youth, purchasing uniforms, marching with swastikas, and embracing a worldview that positioned them as the vanguard of a new America aligned with Nazi ambitions. What makes this movement deeply unsettling is not only the speed and scale of its rise, but how boldly it operated, exploiting American freedoms to promote anti-Semitism, white supremacy, and loyalty to a foreign authoritarian regime. This intro grapples with the uncomfortable truth that America's soil proved fertile ground for fascist fantasies, not because of foreign infiltration alone, but because tens of thousands of citizens believed in them. Beneath patriotic rhetoric and claims of cultural pride lay a movement fueled by resentment, economic anxiety, cultural insecurity, and a longing for belonging, elements that extremist leaders like Fritz Kuhn weaponized masterfully. The Bund's public image, with its crisp uniforms, choreographed rallies, and promises of national renewal, hid a darker machinery of manipulation. A network that targeted German immigrants, disillusioned workers, young idealists, and individuals desperate to feel powerful again after the disorientation brought on by the Great Depression. Under the veneer of ethnic identity and patriotic slogans, the Bund sought nothing less than the ideological transformation of the United States, aiming to replace democratic pluralism with a hierarchical racial order that mirrored Hitler's Germany. Yet the most striking aspect of this history is how American society responded, not uniformly with rejection, as many assume today, but with a complex mixture of curiosity, indifference, outrage, and surprisingly often sympathy. Thousands attended rallies at Madison Square Garden. Newspapers debated whether the movement was dangerous or simply overly enthusiastic ethnic pride, and politicians hesitated to take action for fear of appearing un-American by targeting a cultural association. The Bund thrived in this ambiguity, leveraging free speech protections to spread foreign propaganda and calling themselves victims whenever they faced scrutiny, a tactic eerily familiar in modern extremist movements. But as the decade progressed, the mask cracked. Internal corruption, violent incidents, mounting public backlash, and the growing threat of war revealed the Bund's true character. By the time the FBI intensified its surveillance and Fritz Kuhn was exposed for embezzlement and fraud, the organization's influence began to crumble. Still, the Bund's collapse did not erase the deeper questions it forced the nation to confront. Questions about identity, loyalty, vulnerability, and the fragile boundary between patriotism and nationalism. Its legacy lingers not because its ideology triumphed, but because its existence proved that authoritarianism does not always arrive with tanks and tyranny. Sometimes it arrives wrapped in flags, claiming to protect the nation while seeking to redefine it. The Bund forces us to look at America through an uncomfortable lens, revealing that extremism grows most easily not in foreign soil, but in moments of fear, anger, and uncertainty, moments when propaganda seems like truth, when unity feels impossible, and when simple answers to complex problems appear seductively appealing. This introduction invites readers to step into that world, to see how fragile democratic norms can become when confronted by charismatic demagogues, and to understand how a movement preaching hate and division could find a home in the heart of the United States. It is a story not merely of one organization, but of a society learning, sometimes painfully, that freedom is not self-sustaining. It must be defended not only from enemies abroad, but from the ideologies that take root within. And as we revisit this unsettling chapter nearly a century later, the lessons feel more relevant than ever, that history does not simply repeat itself, but it whispers, warns, and waits to see whether we have learned enough to recognize the dangers when they return wearing a new face. In the years following the First World War, the United States became an unexpected arena for ideological struggles that had their origins thousands of miles away. German immigrants and German Americans, numbering in the millions, carried with them deep cultural heritage, linguistic traditions, and a sense of historical identity shaped by Germany's turbulent early 20th century. While the majority of these communities embraced American democratic ideals and saw the United States as their permanent home, a smaller subset became fertile ground for extremist influences. The collapse of the German Empire in 1918, the humiliations of the Treaty of Versailles, and the economic devastation that followed provided emotional fuel that some German nationalists would later exploit. Ideologues saw America not merely as a place of refuge, but as a strategic platform where sympathetic communities could be mobilized in support of a revived, authoritarian Germany. The groundwork for this cultural infiltration began subtly, with nostalgia for the homeland, cultural pride organizations, and transatlantic correspondence that quietly carried the embers of resentment and radical nationalism. By the early 1920s, German nationalist propaganda began to circulate among expatriate groups in the United States, often disguised as cultural newsletters, veterans bulletins, or community bulletins. These publications mourned the supposed disruption of German honor and accused Western democracies, particularly the United States, of misunderstanding or deliberately sabotaging Germany's place in the world. Such rhetoric resonated with a small number of immigrants who felt disconnected and alienated from American society. Many had arrived in the U.S. before the First World War and experienced intense anti-German sentiment during the conflict, including workplace discrimination, bans on the German language, and harassment in public. These experiences left deep scars, and for some, fostered an embittered longing for cultural validation that extremist propaganda readily exploited. They were encouraged to believe that American democracy had failed them, and that only a strong, disciplined German identity, reborn in the model of the coming nationalist revival, could restore dignity to their community. During the Weimar Republic era, German consulates and nationalist clubs in the United States became informal hubs for political discourse that increasingly blurred the line between cultural celebration and ideological mobilization. Organizations originally founded to preserve German music, traditions, or communal solidarity began to shift subtly in tone. Meetings that once revolved around festivals and folk dances grew to include discussions about Germany's political path, the injustice of Versailles, and the supposed corruption of democratic governance. It was during these discussions that seeds of extremism began to germinate. Small groups formed study circles to dissect nationalist literature, sometimes receiving materials directly from right-wing publishers in Munich and Berlin. Although these groups were still far from embracing outright fascism, their sense of grievance created a psychological opening for more radical messages that would arrive in the following decade. The turning point came with the rise of Adolf Hitler and the Nazi socialist movement in Germany. As Hitler consolidated power in the early 1930s, his regime proved highly adept at exporting ideology beyond its borders. Nazi officials understood that German diaspora communities could serve as ideological ambassadors, non-military extensions of influence who could shape foreign perceptions, rally sympathizers, and undermine democratic cohesion abroad. The United States, with its large German-American population, became a priority target. Propaganda agencies such as the Auslandsorganisation, foreign organization of the Nazi Party, began distributing pamphlets, films, and speeches to expatriate networks, carefully framing Nazism as a restoration of German pride rather than a totalitarian program. These materials emphasized discipline, ethnic unity, and cultural revival, concepts that resonated with those who felt alienated from mainstream American culture. In many communities, Nazi ideology found early adopters who saw in it a way to reconnect with an imagined, purified version of their heritage. As the Nazi message gained traction, German-American social clubs in the United States entered a period of transformation. Leaders who had previously focused on language preservation or cultural festivals began aligning their rhetoric with that of Hitler's Germany. Some clubs adopted hierarchical structures that mirrored Nazi organizations, replete with uniforms, insignia, and rituals meant to evoke feelings of unity and power. Patriotic songs were replaced by nationalist chants, and lectures increasingly centered on the achievements of the new German Reich. For younger generations of German Americans, especially those struggling with economic uncertainty during the Great Depression, the message of strength, order, and ethnic pride held a dangerous allure. What began as cultural pride evolved into ideological militancy even before the formal establishment of the German-American Bund. The American political climate of the 1930s created further opportunities for extremist infiltration. The Great Depression shattered public confidence in institutions, leaving millions desperate for direction. Amid this environment, authoritarian ideologies, both fascist and communist, found footholds among people who felt the existing system had failed them. German nationalist propagandists capitalized on these vulnerabilities, presenting Nazism as a model of stability and economic revival. Their messaging was purposefully crafted to highlight order amid chaos, unity among division, and strength among weakness. They argued that Germany's resurgence under Hitler was proof of the superiority of authoritarian leadership. For disillusioned German Americans grappling with unemployment or social marginalization, these claims seemed plausible and even inspirational. Simultaneously, isolationist sentiment in the United States provided fertile ground for sympathetic views of Germany. Many Americans believed the country should avoid entanglement in European conflicts and resented perceived British and Jewish attempts to drag America into foreign disputes. German propagandists skillfully manipulated these sentiments, framing Nazism as a misunderstood national revival, unfairly demonized by foreign powers. German-American extremists claimed that the United States had been manipulated into opposing Germany during the First World War and insisted that this mistake should not be repeated. This narrative gained particular traction among rural communities and conservative immigrant circles that were deeply skeptical of international engagement. The seeds of extremism scattered across these social landscapes began to sprout as more people accepted the narrative that Nazism was not dangerous, but rather a legitimate political movement wrongly maligned by elites. The role of German-language newspapers in the United States further accelerated the spread of extremist ideology. Publications that once focused on community news increasingly included sympathetic depictions of Hitler's policies. Reports framed the regime's suppression of political dissent as necessary for national salvation, while the persecution of Jews was downplayed or justified through claims of internal security. These narratives subtly normalized authoritarian practices, providing readers with a sanitized image of the Nazi regime. For many German Americans who relied on such newspapers to stay connected to their cultural identity, this biased reporting shaped their understanding of world events, leaving them more vulnerable to radicalization. As ideological currents intensified, new organizations emerged that served as incubators for fascist sympathies. These groups often presented themselves as patriotic American associations dedicated to combating communism, preserving traditional values, or defending Western civilization. In reality, many were deeply influenced, sometimes directly coordinated by Nazi propagandists. These organizations cultivated disciplined structures, held paramilitary-style marches, and hosted meetings where speeches praised Hitler's leadership. While they had not yet coalesced into a centralized movement, the ideological threads that connected them were unmistakable: nationalism, authoritarianism, anti-communism, and, increasingly, anti-Semitism. By the mid-1930s, the groundwork for the German-American Bund had been firmly laid. A network of clubs, newsletters, activists, and informal circles had already embraced extremist ideology. These groups thought of themselves as cultural defenders, guardians of a German identity they believed was under threat in the United States. Fritz Julius Kuhn did not merely emerge as a leader. He was constructed, carefully, deliberately, and with the theatrical precision of a man who understood power not as a duty, but as a performance. Long before he became known as the so-called American Führer, Kuhn had lived a life defined by ambition, insecurity, and the relentless pursuit of authority. Born in Munich in 1896, he grew up in a Germany racked by nationalism, imperial dreams, and political turbulence. His early adulthood coincided with the First World War, where he served briefly in the German military, absorbing the militaristic identity that would later shape his persona. After the war, like many German veterans searching for stability, Kuhn found himself disillusioned, bitter, and deeply resentful of the political chaos that engulfed Weimar Germany. These sentiments, resentment, nostalgia, and a longing for strong leadership, formed the psychological foundation of the man who would later attempt to replicate Hitler's leadership style on American soil. Kuhn immigrated to the United States in the early 1920s, joining thousands of other Germans who were fleeing economic instability and political disarray. But unlike those who sought quiet assimilation, Kuhn viewed America as a stage upon which he could reinvent himself. He was charismatic in a brash, abrasive way, self-confident to the point of arrogance, aggressive in debate, and convinced that leadership was his birthright. He worked odd jobs, including as a chemist in a Detroit factory, yet he never abandoned his dream of rising to political prominence. He joined various German-American cultural groups, quickly distinguishing himself as a man who spoke with unusual zeal about German unity, national revival, and what he framed as the betrayal of Germany by the Allied powers. His oratory was bombastic, theatrical, and designed to provoke not just agreement, but emotional allegiance. The rise of Adolf Hitler in Germany provided the ideological blueprint Kuhn had lacked. When he observed how Hitler transformed resentment into a political movement, Kuhn recognized the model he wanted to follow. He admired Hitler's charisma and his ability to mobilize ordinary citizens into a disciplined, fervent mass. To Kuhn, Hitler was more than a political figure. He was proof that grandiosity could be rewarded, that a man who presented himself as a savior could transform personal ambition into national power. The parallels between Hitler's early political rise and Kuhn's own aspirations were not lost on him. In Hitler's Germany, Kuhn saw the validation of a worldview built on hierarchy, ethnic nationalism, and the elevation of the leader as a semi-sacred figure. By the early 1930s, Kuhn had woven himself deeply into the network of German-American nationalist clubs that had formed across the United States. These organizations, originally fragmented and loosely structured, had been heavily influenced by Nazi propaganda. They served as the ideological breeding ground from which the German-American Bund would emerge. Kuhn initially joined the Friends of New Germany, an early pro-Nazi organization operating in the U.S. under the direct influence of the Nazi Party. He demonstrated ruthless ambition from the start, criticizing other leaders, lobbying German officials for recognition, and positioning himself as indispensable. His relentless push for power eventually led to his takeover of the organization, especially after its earlier leadership became mired in internal disputes and public backlash. When the Friends of New Germany collapsed under scrutiny and pressure from the U.S. government, Kuhn saw an opportunity rather than a defeat. In 1936, he rebranded the movement as the German-American Bund, carefully framing it as an American organization, patriotic, independent, and supposedly respectful of U.S. laws. This rebranding was strategic, designed to deflect accusations of foreign allegiance and to broaden its appeal. Kuhn insisted that the Bund was not an extension of the Nazi Party, even though its ideology, structure, and symbolism were unmistakably derived from Hitler's movement. As he proclaimed himself Bundesführer, Kuhn began constructing a personality cult that mimicked the one Hitler enjoyed in Germany. Kuhn's leadership style blended authoritarian command with theatrical showmanship. He demanded strict discipline within the Bund, establishing a hierarchy of regional leaders, local units, youth divisions, and women's auxiliaries. These meetings were orchestrated with meticulous pageantry, banners draped across walls, uniformed guards at attention, and attendees saluting in the Nazi style. These rallies were spectacles designed not merely to inform, but to immerse participants in a fantasy of power and belonging. Members were encouraged to view Kuhn not as an organizer, but as a visionary leader destined to guide German Americans toward cultural renewal and political influence in the United States. What made Kuhn particularly dangerous was his ability to blend American patriotism with fascist ideology. He styled himself as a defender of true Americanism, claiming that authoritarian discipline and racial purity were essential to the nation's survival. He wrapped himself in the American flag while preaching a worldview fundamentally at odds with democratic values. In his speeches, he railed against communists, Jews, and what he described as the decadence of liberal democracy. He claimed that German Americans were the rightful guardians of Western civilization, uniquely suited to lead the United States away from corruption and back toward order. This rhetoric resonated among those who felt alienated by economic hardship, cultural change, or political uncertainty. Despite his confidence and charisma, Kuhn was plagued by deep insecurities that manifested in erratic, sometimes self-destructive behavior. He was a heavy drinker, known for explosive temper outbursts and scandalous affairs. His womanizing became notorious, and his misuse of Bund funds, often to finance personal indulgences, would later contribute to his downfall. Yet within the Bund, he maintained unquestioned authority. Dissent was suppressed, critics were marginalized, and loyalty to the leader was elevated to a moral duty. Kuhn's authoritarian tendencies were not merely ideological, they were psychological, embedded in his need for validation and the desire to replicate Hitler's model of absolute control. Kuhn's relationship with the official Nazi Party in Germany was complicated and often strained. While he openly idolized Hitler, Nazi officials considered him an embarrassment, too loud, too impulsive, too sloppy. They preferred subtlety in their American operations, while Kuhn sought spectacle and publicity. His attempts to gain personal recognition from Hitler were repeatedly rebuffed, and German diplomats in the U.S. quietly distanced themselves from him. Despite this rejection, Kuhn continued portraying himself as a trusted representative of the Third Reich, using this claim to attract followers and intimidate opponents. His fragile ego required the illusion of legitimacy, even when the truth undermined his narrative. Under Kuhn's rule, the Bund expanded rapidly, reaching tens of thousands of members across the country. It established headquarters in New York, training camps in New Jersey and Wisconsin, and youth programs modeled after the Hitler Youth. These institutions allowed Kuhn to implement his ideological vision on a national scale. Children were taught obedience, discipline, and ethnic pride. Adults received ideological training and paramilitary drills, and women were assigned roles that emphasized motherhood, loyalty, and racial purity. The Bund became more than a political group. It became a parallel society, a community built around authoritarian identity and the myth of German superiority. The rise of the German-American Bund was not limited to speeches, meetings, and scattered rallies. It manifested most visibly and dramatically in the creation of camps and ideological spaces designed to project the image of a fully realized fascist subculture on American soil. These camps were not merely recreational sites. They were stages upon which the Bund attempted to display its imagined future, a disciplined, ethnically defined America shaped by authoritarian ideals. Through pageantry, rigid hierarchy, militaristic drills, and deliberate indoctrination, these camps became the physical embodiment of the Bund's dream of a new America, one that blended German nationalism with the superficial veneer of American patriotism. They were built to impress, to intimidate, and, most importantly, to manufacture the illusion that the Bund was more influential, more unified, and more powerful than it truly was. The most well-known of these sites was Camp Siegfried, located in Yaphank, Long Island, New York. Established in 1936, it quickly became the Bund's flagship showcase. Visitors arriving at the camp were greeted by meticulously groomed landscapes adorned with swastikas and banners bearing symbols adapted from Nazi Germany. Streets were given names like Adolf Hitler Street, and the camp's architecture borrowed heavily from German rural aesthetics designed to invoke a sense of Heimat, homeland. The message was unmistakable. Here was a slice of the Third Reich transplanted onto American soil. Families gathered for weekend retreats, children marched in youth drills, and leaders delivered speeches extolling the virtues of a racially unified America. The Bund hoped that such spaces would normalize their ideology, presenting it as wholesome, communal, and rooted in traditional values, rather than hatred and division. Camp Siegfried was not the only such site. Across the country, the Bund established a network of camps, including Camp Nordland in New Jersey, Camp Hindenburg in Wisconsin, and several smaller locations scattered throughout the Northeast and Midwest. Each functioned as both a training ground and a propaganda center. Adults participated in marches, listened to ideological lectures, and engaged in paramilitary drills meant to mimic the structure of the Nazi SA. These drills, though often disorganized and more theatrical than functional, were designed to instill a sense of discipline and unity among participants. Children and teenagers were indoctrinated through youth programs modeled explicitly on the Hitler Youth, complete with uniforms, songs, and ritualized salutes. They were taught that their heritage made them part of a superior cultural lineage, and that it was their duty to safeguard the future of the white race. Yet behind this meticulously staged facade lay a more complex reality. Many camps operated with limited funding, poorly trained personnel, and internal disputes over leadership. The Bund frequently exaggerated its numbers, inflating membership statistics to appear more formidable. The camps therefore served a dual purpose. They were sites of internal morale building and external propaganda. Photographs taken at these gatherings were distributed widely, circulated in German-language newspapers, and presented to sympathetic audiences as proof of the Bund's growth. To outsiders, these images conveyed a sense of dramatic unity, hundreds of people marching in formation, banners fluttering, and crowds cheering beneath the swastika and the American flag flown side by side. The visual symbolism was powerful, designed to convey that fascism could thrive within American culture, not as an alien threat, but as a natural extension of patriotic identity. Propaganda was central to the Bund's efforts. Its leaders understood that ideology needed constant reinforcement, both through direct messaging and through symbols that evoked emotional loyalty. Newspapers such as the Deutscher Weckruf und Beobachter, German Wake-Up Call and Observer, served as the Bund's primary mouthpiece. Modeled after the Nazi Party's Völkischer Beobachter, it carried articles praising Hitler's achievements, warning against communist infiltration, and attacking Jewish communities as alleged enemies of both Germany and America. Each issue aimed to create a sense of existential struggle, convincing readers that the Bund represented the last line of defense against forces seeking to dismantle Western civilization. The newspaper also promoted upcoming rallies, published photos of Bund events, and featured editorials that echoed Nazi racial ideology, all while insisting that the movement was entirely American. Public rallies were another crucial component of the Bund's propaganda machine. The most infamous of these took place on February 20, 1939, at Madison Square Garden in New York City. Nearly 20,000 supporters gathered beneath a towering banner featuring George Washington flanked by swastikas. Fritz Kuhn delivered a fiery speech denouncing President Franklin D. Roosevelt as a puppet of Jewish interests and calling for a racially pure, authoritarian America. The rally was orchestrated with military precision. Uniformed guards patrolled the aisles, youth divisions stood at attention, and the crowd erupted in synchronized cheers at Kuhn's commands. The event showcased the Bund's ability to stage a spectacle of intimidation, using patriotic imagery to mask its fascist intentions. To many Americans, the rally was a horrifying display of extremism. To Bund members, it was proof that their movement had entered the national spotlight. But propaganda is a fragile weapon. The Bund's illusion of strength depended on maintaining an aura of unity and moral purpose. Yet behind the scenes, the organization was fracturing. Internal disputes erupted over finances, leadership, and the direction of the movement. Fritz Kuhn's personal scandals, combined with growing scrutiny from journalists and the U.S. government, undermined the credibility of his leadership. The camps and rallies that once symbolized power gradually became sources of controversy and public alarm. Newspapers across the country published investigative reports exposing the Bund's true ideological aims, its ties to Nazi Germany, and its paramilitary activities. These revelations fueled public backlash, pushing American communities to distance themselves from the movement. Moreover, the Bund's propaganda failed to win over the majority of German Americans, many of whom viewed Kuhn and his followers as extremists who tarnished their community's reputation. While the Bund tried to portray itself as the rightful voice of German heritage in America, its open embrace of Nazi symbolism repelled far more people than it attracted. The illusion of a new America under Bund leadership began to crumble as its contradictions became impossible to ignore. Its vision clashed fundamentally with American democratic values, and its attempt to fuse fascism with patriotism exposed an ideological incoherence that even sympathetic audiences struggled to reconcile. The camps, once proud showcases of Bund identity, gradually turned into liabilities. Local governments imposed restrictions, citizens protested their presence, and journalists infiltrated events to document the organization's activities. In some cases, camp leaders attempted to conceal their extremist nature by emphasizing family activities and wholesome recreation. But the charade fooled few. The militaristic drills, the anti-Semitic speeches, and the rigid hierarchical structure all revealed the true purpose of these sites. The illusion of community masked an authoritarian ethos designed to reshape the identity of its followers. As tensions in Europe escalated in the late 1930s and early 1940s, the Bund intensified its messaging, warning that America must side with Germany to prevent a communist takeover of the world. This desperate push for relevance revealed the movement's growing panic. The more the Bund tried to present itself as a major force in American politics, the more transparent its desperation became. Its propaganda grew shrill, its rallies increasingly disjointed, and its internal divisions impossible to conceal. The illusion of a powerful, unified fascist movement began to disintegrate, exposing the Bund as a fragile construction held together by bluster, spectacle, and the inflated ego of Fritz Kuhn. The German-American Bund entered the late 1930s with the swagger of a movement that believed it had finally secured its place in American society. With its camps, rallies, and growing public attention, the organization projected an image of power, an illusion reinforced by its increasingly elaborate spectacles. Yet beneath this veneer, the Bund was becoming unstable. Its leadership was fractured by internal corruption, its ideological contradictions were becoming more visible, and its attempts to merge Nazi ideology with American patriotism were beginning to unravel. What ultimately accelerated the movement's downfall was a combination of public outrage, investigative journalism, and relentless federal scrutiny, led by the FBI under the direction of J. Edgar Hoover. The FBI had been monitoring fascist, communist, and other extremist groups throughout the 1930s, but the Bund's escalating activities placed it at the center of federal concern. Hoover viewed extremist movements on both the far left and far right as threats to national security. Yet the Bund's open admiration for Hitler and its paramilitary-style operations made it particularly alarming. FBI agents infiltrated local chapters, attended rallies undercover, and systematically collected information on Bund leaders, finances, and communications. These investigations revealed not only the movement's ideological allegiance to Nazi Germany, but also its sprawling network of branches, each vying for influence within the larger organization. As the FBI amassed evidence, the Bund's public image became increasingly volatile. Journalists exposed its anti-Semitic agenda, its hierarchical structure modeled on the Nazi Party, and its attempts to groom youth through indoctrination programs. Newspapers published exposés revealing the movement's internal corruption, including Fritz Kuhn's misuse of funds, extravagant lifestyle, and scandalous affairs. What the Bund had hoped would be seen as a renaissance of German-American pride was now widely recognized as a radical movement infiltrated by authoritarian ideology. Public backlash grew steadily. Communities across the United States began protesting Bund events, organizing counter-rallies, and demanding local governments shut down the camps. Jewish organizations, veterans groups, labor unions, and church leaders formed a coalition of moral resistance, arguing that the Bund represented an affront to American values. The spectacle of uniformed marchers saluting beneath swastikas and American flags ignited outrage in cities such as New York, Chicago, and Los Angeles. For many Americans, especially those who had fought in World War I, the sight of Nazi symbolism on American soil was intolerable. The turning point came with the now infamous 1939 Madison Square Garden rally. While the Bund celebrated it as their greatest triumph, the event backfired catastrophically. Newsreels showed the shocking juxtaposition of George Washington's image surrounded by swastikas. Speeches filled with anti-Semitic invective further alienated the public. At the same time, the violent removal of a young man who rushed the stage in protest revealed the organization's readiness to embrace brutality. Rather than legitimizing the Bund, the rally transformed it into a national scandal, proof that Nazi ideology had penetrated American public life in ways many had previously dismissed. Following the rally, pressure on government officials intensified. New York Mayor Fiorelauer Gardia ordered a series of investigations into the Bund's operations, calling for a full audit of its finances. Prosecutors soon discovered what insiders already suspected. Fritz Kuhn had been embezzling funds to support a lavish lifestyle, including spending Bund money on extramarital affairs, expensive clothing, and personal travel. The revelations provided not only legal grounds for prosecution, but also a symbolic victory for the Bund's critics. Kuhn's arrest and subsequent conviction on charges of larceny and forgery shattered the illusion of the charismatic, disciplined leader at the heart of the movement. With Kuhn imprisoned, the Bund struggled to maintain cohesion. Rival factions emerged, each claiming to represent the true vision of the organization. Membership began to decline as members grew disillusioned or feared being associated with an increasingly toxic brand of extremism. Meanwhile, the FBI expanded its investigations, targeting not only Bund leaders, but also their connections to German diplomats and Nazi propaganda agencies. Federal agents intercepted communications, raided offices, and increasingly shared their findings with the public. By exposing the Bund's foreign ties, the FBI undermined its claim to be purely American, a claim already strained by its overt use of Nazi symbols and rhetoric. The outbreak of World War II in Europe in September 1939 intensified scrutiny. As Germany invaded Poland and war swept across the continent, American attitudes towards the Bund hardened. Isolationist sentiment remained strong in certain political circles, but the Bund's attempts to exploit the sentiment were increasingly met with skepticism. Many Americans who had previously supported policies of non-intervention now viewed the Bund as a fifth column, an internal threat aligned with a hostile foreign power. The FBI capitalized on these shifting attitudes. Hoover expanded undercover operations and worked with state and local authorities to limit the Bund's activities. Some camps were forced to shut down, others faced strict surveillance. Meetings were raided, leaders were subpoenaed, and financial records were seized. The Bund responded by accusing the government of persecuting German Americans, but the argument gained little traction. Too much evidence had emerged exposing the organization's alignment with Nazi Germany. By 1940, the Bund's influence was in steep decline. Without Kuhn's larger-than-life persona, the movement lacked charismatic leadership. Internal power struggles turned increasingly bitter, with rival factions accusing each other of collaboration with the FBI or of betraying the organization's principles. The once carefully crafted illusion of unity had dissolved completely. Simultaneously, the camps that once had been symbols of Nazi American pride became symbols of shame. Many were abandoned, sold, or repurposed as communities sought to erase the traces of fascist presence. The final blow to the Bund came after the United States entered World War II following the attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941. The FBI immediately arrested dozens of Bund leaders under the Alien Enemies Act, seizing what remained of their offices and shutting down their publications. The organization was effectively dismantled, its members scattered, its influence extinguished. Fritz Kuhn, once the self-proclaimed American Führer, was stripped of his citizenship, deported to Germany after the war, and ultimately died in obscurity. Across the shifting landscapes of 20th-century American history, the legacy of the German-American Bund endures as a complicated, often unsettling reminder that fascism was never solely a European phenomenon. Rather, it found fertile soil in pockets of the United States, communities shaped by economic anxiety, ethnic pride, political disillusionment, and the powerful allure of authoritarian certainty. The Bund did not simply vanish after its collapse. Instead, its story seeped into the broader narrative of American extremism, where the shadows of its ideology lingered long after its rallies ended, its leaders were imprisoned or deported, and its camps lay abandoned. Its rise and fall form a cautionary arc, one that forces Americans to confront questions about national identity, vulnerability, and the persistent allure of radical solutions during turbulent times. The memory of the Bund's rise is uncomfortable in part because it challenges the popular myth that the United States was always unified in its opposition to Nazi ideology. During the 1930s, millions of Americans watched the rise of Hitler with a mixture of curiosity, admiration, fear, or indifference. Isolationism dominated public opinion. Organizations like the America First Committee received enormous support, arguing that European wars were not America's concern. Within this climate, the Bund positioned itself as a movement of patriotic dissenters, loyal Germans trying to restore a sense of pride and cultural belonging. Their rhetoric exploited the fractures in American society, particularly the distrust many felt toward government institutions after the Great Depression. The Bunds claim that they were simply exercising American freedoms while simultaneously praising dictatorship, revealed the paradoxes that extremist groups often weaponize. After the Bund dissolved, the United States had to grapple not only with the direct consequences of its existence, but also with what it represented: the vulnerability of a democratic society when confronted with charismatic demagogues. Many Americans preferred to bury the uncomfortable fact that, at the height of the Bund's influence, thousands openly marched under swastikas in American cities, filling Madison Square Garden and cheering for a man they called the American Führer. For decades, this chapter of history was rarely discussed in classrooms or public discourse. The nation's narrative of the Good War, a righteous struggle against fascism, left little room to examine how deeply fascist ideas had once taken root on its own shores. This selective memory helped ensure that the Bund story remained obscured, remembered mostly by specialists, archivists, and communities that still carried the emotional scars of its propaganda. Yet the Bund's legacy did not disappear. Instead, fragments of its ideology re-emerged in subsequent waves of American extremism. White supremacist groups of the 1950s and 1960s borrowed imagery and rhetoric from Nazi ideology, while later movements, ranging from neo-Nazis to militia organizations, revived themes of racial purity, anti-government sentiment, and conspiratorial thinking. In each resurgence, historians could trace echoes of the Bund: the appeal to ethnic identity as political destiny, the romanticizing of a mythic homeland, the scapegoating of minorities, and the belief in a looming national decline that only radical transformation could reverse. These recurrences reinforced the idea that extremism is not an aberration, but a recurring part of American political life, arising whenever social and economic instability intersect with grievance and nostalgia. Understanding the Bund's legacy also requires examining the role of law enforcement, particularly the FBI. The Bureau's campaign against the Bund, while effective in destabilizing the organization, proved that government surveillance and prosecution alone cannot extinguish extremist ideology. The Bund's members, after all, did not vanish because they abandoned their beliefs. Many simply retreated into private life, carrying with them the same prejudices, suspicions, and resentments that had once fueled their activism. Some continued to network quietly, influencing local politics or social circles, while others passed down attitudes that persisted across generations. This reality underscores a recurring challenge. Dismantling an extremist organization does not necessarily dismantle the worldview that created it. The Bund also left behind a physical legacy: its camps, meeting halls, and archives, each a fragment of the movement's presence in the United States. Some of these sites decayed into obscurity, reclaimed by nature, suburban development, or historical amnesia. Others became subjects of local controversy as communities debated whether to preserve or erase the evidence of a fascist past. In these debates lies a broader question: how should a democracy remember chapters of its history that contradict its ideals? Should remnants of such movements be destroyed to prevent glorification, or preserved to educate future generations? The struggle over memory is itself a reflection of the Bund's unfinished legacy, a reminder that history is not only about what happened, but also about what societies choose to confront or avoid. In recent decades, scholars, filmmakers, and journalists have revived interest in the Bund, bringing its story into public view through documentaries, books, digital archives, and investigative reporting. This renewed attention has revealed a growing recognition that understanding the Bund is vital to understanding modern extremism. The parallels between the Bund's rise and contemporary movements are striking. Economic anxiety exploited for ideological gain, misinformation spread through charismatic leaders, appeals to nostalgia, and the portrayal of enemies, real or imagined, as existential threats. Each of these elements played a central role in the Bund's growth, and each continues to shape the rhetoric of extremist movements in the 21st century. The Bund thus serves as a historical mirror, reflecting the vulnerabilities that persist in democratic societies. Ultimately, the Bund story offers a critical lesson about the power of memory. Forgetting or minimizing extremist movements does not prevent their return. If anything, silence creates fertile ground for the next generation of radicals to claim that their ideas are new, misunderstood, or unfairly suppressed. Confronting the Bund's legacy, its hatred, its ambitions, its failures, forces Americans to recognize that extremism arises not only from foreign threats but from internal fractures. Racism, alienation, economic despair, and the persistent myth that authoritarianism offers clarity in times of chaos. The Bund may have collapsed, but the conditions that allowed it to flourish are recurring patterns woven into the fabric of American history. The uncomfortable memory of the German-American Bund ultimately invites a deeper understanding of the responsibilities that democracies must uphold. It calls for vigilance rooted not in fear but in awareness, an awareness that democracy is not self-sustaining, but requires continuous engagement, education, and a willingness to confront histories that challenge cherished national narratives. The Bund's legacy is not simply a warning from the past, it is an ongoing call to action, reminding Americans that extremism arises not only from foreign threats, but from internal fractures, racism, alienation, economic despair, and the persistent myth that authoritarianism offers clarity in times of chaos.